Hello, this is North Bend Presbyterian's Adult Sunday School for May 23rd. I'm Wayne Miller. Last week, we resumed our studies in the book of Isaiah. We considered chapter 5, a poem that starts as a love song, but then changes to a message of judgment for the sins of injustice and unrighteousness. Now, I hope you noticed the connection between this poem, especially the Vineyard Song, with Pastor Eric's messages from 1 John. Remember the expectation that the vineyard will produce good fruit? And then we tied it into New Testament teaching about bearing fruit. Well, John in his epistle has that same expectation and command. Think about it. Remember that Jesus ties the fruit into love. He says that love is the fruit. Remember in 1 John the emphasis on loving God and loving one another? As I study the scriptures, I'm constantly amazed at how consistent and connected they are, and how the message is reinforced when we are taking in the word from different sources. Now, as we go through the first 35 chapters of Isaiah, the message of judgment predominates, with warnings of Judah's future captivity. Chapters 34 and 35 are a little different, as they are primarily concerned with the restoration of displaced Israel, first through judgment on the other nations, and then through the restoration of the land and God's righteous governance. Those chapters are followed by a historical interlude, a narrative primarily in prose rather than poetry, which covers the Assyrian invasion of Judah and Hezekiah's response, ending with a visit from Babylonian representatives during which Hezekiah showed off all of Judah's and his own treasures and armaments. Isaiah then intrudes with a word from God. The Babylonians are going to make use of that information and will eventually take it all to Babylon, along with Hezekiah's descendants. Then we come to chapter 40, and there's a new tone and a new perspective in the book. Beginning with chapter 40, the rest of the book is often called the Book of Comfort. Today we will look at chapter 40 in some detail. Now, Isaiah 40 is one of the best-known chapters in the whole book. And reading through it, one definitely gets a very positive and comforting message. But there are quite a few places where the exact meaning is not clear. In fact, there are about half a dozen places where translators struggle with the proper English rendering. I do not claim to know which readings are correct, but we can get a lot out of it anyway. There is a consensus among commentators that there is a dramatic change in style when we get to chapter 40. Most recent scholars, using the historical critical approach, say that this section could not have been written by the same person as the first 39 chapters because the writer seems to be in the exilic and later post-exilic community. By that reasoning, of course, John could not have written the Revelation, and in fact, it could not have been written yet, because the writer seems to be in a time that is still future. Some commentators, who actually believe that Isaiah himself wrote the entire book, say that he must have written this section when he was much older than when he wrote the first 39 chapters, since he is more mellow and was no longer such a firebrand. And Brueggemann goes so far as to say that the text was reshaped by writers in the 6th century and perhaps the 5th to fit the theological needs of their own time. All of this ignores Peter's explanation. And I quote, "Above all, you must understand that no prophecy of Scripture came about by the prophet's own interpretation. For prophecy never had its origin in the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." That's 2 Peter 1:20. The dramatic change of style is not a change in literary style. That is remarkably consistent throughout the book, with similar vocabulary and grammatical constructions. Rather, it's a change in subject matter, and while God used a human instrument, both sections were his message to Judah and remain his message to us. The Book of Comfort is the source of many New Testament quotations which are applied to Jesus the Messiah, and the first use of the term gospel to refer to God's redemptive work. More on that later. So let's get into the chapter. We'll begin by reading the first 8 verses. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling, in the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, Cry out. And I said, What shall I cry? All people are like grass, and all their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fail, because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God endures forever. Now in verse 1, God is speaking. Here the King James makes it more clear than modern translations, since the verb is a plural imperative. We might say, You all comfort my people. The consensus of commentators is that God is speaking to the divine council, which is understood as the government of heaven, made up probably of angelic beings, subservient to God himself. We see hints of this elsewhere in the Old Testament. The announcement is that Judah's righteous sentence of judgment has been served, and the captives in Babylon will return to their own land. In the context of the divine council, verse 3 is often rendered as, A voice cries out, In the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord. That is, one of the members of the council is speaking, crying out. The image that follows is a common one in the time of Isaiah. A new highway is being built for the king and his army to come to Jerusalem in full sight of the nations. It makes the return easy, triumphant, and speedy. Now the immediate application of this passage is clearly to the return of the exiles from Babylon, but the New Testament makes clear that this announcement is not limited to them. All 4 Gospels apply to John the Baptist announcing the coming of Jesus as Messiah. Verse 6 through 8 can be a bit puzzling, and they're variously interpreted. A significant question is, who is the I who responds to the order to cry out? And that also affects who it is that's crying out. The most obvious reading is that I is Isaiah himself. If the passage is taken as a parallel to chapter 6, the call of Isaiah, we can see this as a second call. In place of the discouraging message laid out in chapter 6, the message of judgment and of Israel not responding, Isaiah is now called to bring the message of God's comfort to his people, who will return from exile. If that is true, it can be read as Isaiah protesting, as he did in chapter 6. There he says he is unworthy of the call, since he is a man of unclean lips. Here he may be saying he is unworthy of the call, since he is a mortal, in contrast to the one whose message he is called to bear. Or some suggest he may be saying that this message will be wasted upon the exiles, who are as grass, so it is not worth proclaiming. While we cannot be certain, it seems that verse 8 is spoken by the voice of verse 6 in response to Isaiah's protest. And to be clear, there are other ways to read this, but this is the one that makes the most sense to me. Isaiah's point is acknowledged in verse 8. The people being as grass, or he being as grass, that will wither and fail. But the message of comfort is not based upon the qualifications of the messenger or the recipients, but on the character of God himself. And this interpretation, certainly consistent with other scripture, speaks to us. We are not called to minister to those around us based on our qualifications, whether we're good enough or educated enough or eloquent enough to bear this message. Nor is our call contingent on their qualifications, on whether they deserve God's message. Rather, our call is based on who gives the message and who is the one calling us. And this applies both to meeting spiritual needs, evangelism and discipling, and to meeting physical and emotional needs. God gives his message of comfort to those who cannot earn it, who do not deserve it. He calls us to do the same, not because we are qualified, but because it is his message. Verse 9 introduces the theme of the gospel. Most translations render the Hebrew word as good tidings or good news. That's one word in the Hebrew. The word was used typically of bringing news of a successful battle or military campaign. It's found in that sense in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. And in fact, it can be used in such situations when the news is not good, but this is much less common. This is the first time in the Old Testament that this word is used to describe God's message. Let's read verses 9 through 11. You who bring good news to Zion, go up on a high mountain. You who bring good news to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up. Do not be afraid. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and he rules with a mighty arm. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense accompanies him. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. The passage starts with a series of imperatives to the messenger, presumably Isaiah. Go up, lift it up. Don't be afraid, say. Powerful words. And the good news is summarized. Look, here is your God. The exiles have not seen the hand of God, for the most part, in Babylon. And the Babylonians, in their arrogance, thought that by their own strength and cunning they had conquered Judah, as well as many other nations. But now, Yahweh reappears dramatically. Note the power and the mighty arm. Both Babylon and Judah will see his power, but to his own, he is also seen as a shepherd caring tenderly for his flock. This juxtaposition of power and majesty, accompanied by tender mercy, is seen in the previous return to the Promised Land from Egypt, back in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 30 and 31. We read, "The Lord your God, who is going before you, will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt before your very eyes and in the desert." There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a father carries his child all the way you went until you reached this place. Moving on, the rest of the poem draws a contrast between Israel's God, Yahweh, and everything else, all other gods, all people, all things. It begins with a series of rhetorical questions which assert that God as creator is incomparable in power and wisdom. No one can do what he has done. No one is competent to advise or teach him anything. Hence, other gods, such as those of Babylon, which during the captivity seemed to have the upper hand, are infinitely inferior to him. Beginning with verse 12, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord, or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him, and who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed him the path of understanding?" The answer to all of these questions, of course, is obvious. It's God who has done these great things, and nobody can fathom his spirit or instruct him or give him advice. And not only are the gods of the nations negligible compared to Yahweh, so too are the nations themselves. Surely, verse 15, the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Take a moment and think about the imagery here. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. And Lebanon, if you recall, was noted for its lush forests, its ample wood. Before him all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. In the light of all this, the poet goes on to belittle the gods of the nations, pointing out that there is no substance behind them. They are worthless idols. Verse 18, "With whom then will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? As for an idol, a metal worker casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and fashions silver chains for it. A person too poor to present such an offering selects wood that will not rot. They look for a skilled worker to set up an idol that will not topple." How contemptuous it sounds, and that's the contrast between God and the idols, the false gods. Now Israel is criticized for not recognizing or remembering who their God really is. Verse 21, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy, and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught, and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than he blows on them, and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff." That last verse, verse 24, recalls the image of the early part of the chapter when the people of Judah are compared to grass or flowers that wither. And it is used here to contrast human powers with God's infinite power. Moving right along, verse 25, "To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing." In reading these verses, we should remember that the Babylonian rulers, along with many other nations at that time, called upon astrologers for advice, and some of the stars or constellations were considered to be deities. But God is their creator. He orchestrates their appearance in perfect detail. He counts them, he numbers them. They do not rival God. There is no comparison. God puts them where they belong. After all these general comparisons of God to idols of various kinds, the poetry now becomes personal to the people of Israel. And there is both a stern rebuke and a glorious promise in the conclusion to the chapter. Verse 27, "Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Have you ever felt as if God didn't know or understand what you are going through? I have, and I suspect most of us have, at one time or another. But even as we feel this way, we can rest assured that it is not true. Sometimes we need to contradict our own feelings with fact. In this passage, we have a recapitulation and summary of what has been said about God earlier, but added to that is the promise that those who hope in the Lord, that is, trust him to do what he has said he will do, will be rejuvenated. We will share in God's strength and endurance. God did not finish the creation and then just let it be. He continues to work in his creation without fatigue or losing interest. And it says here, he takes special interest in those who hope in him, who believe he is who he says he is. Well, that's a quick run-through of chapter 40. Your assignment is to reread the chapter, thinking about how it can help you in times of difficulty, even disaster, and how you can use it when everything is going well for you as well. Next week, I think we'll look at chapters 56 and 57, so you might want to take a look at them in advance. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for being with us today.